I never expected that a simple act of fasting would lead me to the most mind-bending, life-changing experience of my life. But that's exactly what happened. For as long as I could remember, I felt spiritually adrift. My life had become a blur of routines, and though I went through the motions, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I wasn't angry at God, but I felt disconnected, distant. A teacher by profession, I was used to helping others understand lessons, but I couldn't seem to find my own sense of clarity or peace. The more I tried to force my faith back into place, the more empty I felt. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through scripture and contemplating my next steps, something inside me stirred. A thought that felt almost like a whisper. What if fasting could bring me closer to God? That was the turning point. I decided then and there to embark on a 7-day water fast. No food, just water. I had read stories of people finding spiritual breakthroughs through fasting, and if I were to be honest, I was desperate for one. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. As I prepared for the fast, I remember telling a close friend that I wasn't doing this for any grand outcome, but simply as a way to cleanse my spirit and seek a deeper connection with God. I felt hopeful, perhaps naively hopeful, that this would bring me the peace I so badly needed. But nothing could prepare me for the journey ahead. You won't believe what happened to me after I started fasting. Stay with me, because I'm about to share something you won't find anywhere else. Make sure to watch till the end. You don't want to miss the shocking turn this story takes. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can follow more of my journey. Now, let's dive in. The first 3 days of the fast were harder than I expected. The hunger pangs came and went like waves, and I felt weak and irritable. My body was clearly resisting, but oddly enough, my mind was starting to quiet down. By the end of the 3rd day, I noticed something shifting inside me. Like my heart and soul were finally tuning into a frequency I couldn't quite explain. Day 4 began with a heaviness I couldn't shake. My body was sluggish, as if weighed down by an invisible force, but at the same time, my mind felt sharp and focused. There was an undeniable clarity in my thoughts, and though I couldn't put my finger on it, I felt closer to something bigger than myself. I spent most of that day in prayer and reflection. There were moments where I felt an unusual peace washing over me, almost like someone was whispering, "You're not alone." I clung to that feeling, thinking it was the breakthrough I had been praying for. I had no idea that the true turning point was just hours away. That evening, I decided to take a short drive. Sitting inside my apartment felt stifling, and I needed fresh air. The sun had just set, and the streets were bathed in that soft twilight glow. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember driving slowly, my thoughts drifting between prayers and reflections on the fast. The radio was off, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of the evening breeze through the cracked window. It was one of those moments where everything feels still, as if the world is holding its breath. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. A car came speeding through an intersection to my left. I barely had time to react. The screeching of tires and the deafening crunch of metal collided in an instant. My world went black. I can't describe what happened next in logical terms, but I remember feeling weightless, as though I had been lifted out of my body. It was as if the crash had ejected me, not just physically, but spiritually. The next thing I knew, I was no longer in my car. I wasn't even on Earth. It's hard to explain where I was, because it didn't feel like a physical place. It felt like stepping into another dimension entirely. Everything around me was light, brilliant, glowing light that seemed alive. The colors weren't just bright, They were indescribable, unlike anything I'd ever seen on Earth. They radiated peace, warmth, and a sense of overwhelming clarity. And the silence. Oh, the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something far greater. Like every part of creation was speaking in harmony, yet without words. At first, I was confused. I tried to move, but my body didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. There was no pain, no fear, just an overwhelming sense of calm. For a brief moment, I thought I might have been dreaming, but deep down, I knew this was no dream. As I looked around, I saw something that took my breath away. Rising from the earth below me were shimmering threads of light. They stretched upward like golden beams, breaking through a layer of thick, dark mist that seemed to cover the world. The mist pulsed and swirled, dense and impenetrable, yet these threads pierced through it effortlessly. I didn't know what they were at first, but as I stared at them, the answer came to me. Not through words, but through a knowing that filled my entire being. They were prayers. Each shimmering thread represented a prayer rising from earth, some strong and radiant, others faint and flickering. I could see where they came from, feel their energy, and even sense the hearts behind them. The stronger ones seemed to come from people who were fasting, pouring their hearts out with sincerity and desperation. Their prayers cut through the darkness with a force I can only describe as supernatural. The dark mist below was oppressive, almost alive, and it seemed to push back against the light. But no matter how much it swirled and tried to envelop the threads, it couldn't extinguish them. The prayers were relentless, cutting through like swords. I don't know how long I stood there, mesmerized by the beauty of it all. Time didn't seem to exist in that realm. But as I watched, I felt something or someone calling me. It wasn't a voice, but an irresistible pull, like a current drawing me towards something greater. I couldn't resist it. I didn't want to resist it. And so, I let myself go, drifting toward the light and whatever awaited me beyond. As I drifted closer to the light, I became aware of something extraordinary. The space around me wasn't just filled with light. It was the light. It was alive, moving gently, like waves on a calm ocean, but with an energy I could feel in every part of me. It wasn't blinding or harsh, though it was brighter than anything I'd ever seen. Instead, it felt welcoming, wrapping itself around me like a warm embrace. The air, or whatever this place was made of, carried a profound sense of peace. It was as if all the noise, worry, and chaos I'd known on Earth had been stripped away. There was no heaviness, no distractions, just clarity. Every breath I'd ever taken on Earth suddenly felt incomplete compared to this moment. I stood, or floated perhaps. It was hard to tell, taking it all in. Time didn't seem to exist here. There was no rush, no urgency. I could simply be. The threads of light I'd noticed before were still there, stretching upward from the earth far below me. They shimmered and pulsed, almost like they were alive. Each thread had its own unique rhythm, its own strength. Some were steady and unwavering, glowing with a brilliance that lit up the space around them. Others flickered faintly, as though the energy behind them was running low. As I focused on these threads, a deep understanding settled over me. These weren't just abstract lights, they were connections. Each one carried the prayers of someone fasting and praying on earth. I didn't hear their words, but I felt their intentions, their heartbeats. It was as though their emotions, their desires, were woven into the very fabric of the light. Some threads were filled with hope, others with desperation. I felt the cries of parents pleading for their children, individuals wrestling with personal battles, and communities coming together in unity. The stronger threads were surrounded by a kind of golden glow, as if they carried a special power that radiated outward. But what struck me most was how these prayers pierced through the dark mist that hovered below. The mist was thick and ominous, constantly shifting as though it were alive. It looked suffocating, like it was trying to swallow up the world beneath it. Yet, no matter how heavy it seemed, the prayers sliced through it effortlessly. I found myself captivated by the way the light and the mist interacted. The mist pushed and swirled, trying to block the threads. But it couldn't. The light was stronger. I felt a strange sense of relief watching it, like I was witnessing a battle, but one where hope was destined to win. As I observed, I noticed something else. The prayers weren't just rising on their own. They were being guided, almost pulled upward by something, or someone I couldn't see. It was as if the light itself was reaching down, drawing the prayers closer. I felt myself being drawn closer too. The peace around me was intoxicating, but there was something deeper calling to me. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence. It felt personal, as though it knew me intimately. Yet it wasn't invasive. It was warm and kind, and it made me feel safe, in a way I'd never experienced before. As I moved deeper into this realm, I noticed that the light seemed to take on new shapes. It wasn't static. It shifted, almost like it was responding to my thoughts and feelings. At times, it looked like flowing rivers of gold, other times like cascading waterfalls of pure white light. There were moments when the light sparkled, as if tiny stars were being born right in front of me. The closer I got, the more I felt a sense of connection, not just to the light, but to everything. It was as if the barriers that separate people and places on earth didn't exist here. I felt tied to every prayer, every person sending them, and even to the mist that surrounded the world. I could sense the weight of humanity's struggles, but also the power of their hope. I don't know how long I stayed in that place. Time didn't feel linear. It stretched and folded in ways I couldn't comprehend. All I knew was that I didn't want to leave. For the first time in years, I felt whole, complete. I found myself silently thanking God for bringing me here, though I didn't speak the words out loud. I didn't need to. Every thought, every feeling I had seemed to resonate through the space, as though it was instantly understood. Then, something shifted. The light around me grew even brighter, almost blinding. For a moment, I felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. I knew something, or someone, was coming. I stood there, waiting, my heart pounding with anticipation. As the light around me grew brighter, it felt as though I was being invited deeper into this realm. The brilliance wasn't harsh or overwhelming. It was warm and alive, filling me with an indescribable peace. Yet, at the same time, I could sense something significant was about to happen. Something that would forever change how I viewed the act of fasting. I became aware of movements within the light, subtle at first, but then growing more distinct. Shapes and patterns began to form, and it was as though the light itself was communicating with me. Not in words, but in truths that resonated deep within my soul. I felt a pull to focus on the shimmering threads of light rising from earth. They were still piercing through the dark mist, unyielding and powerful. As I watched, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The threads weren't just breaking through the darkness, they were transforming it. Each thread seemed to carry a force that pushed back against the mist, dissolving it in small but meaningful ways. It was as if the prayers of fasting believers were actively reclaiming territory, illuminating areas of darkness and restoring them to light. I was struck by the sheer beauty and power of it. It was then that an understanding washed over me. Fasting wasn't just an act of self-denial or personal discipline, it was a spiritual weapon. The threads of light carried more than just words. They carried faith, surrender, and a kind of divine energy that amplified the prayers. Fasting opened pathways that weren't accessible through ordinary prayer. It was like a key, unlocking doors that had been tightly sealed, allowing God's power to flow into situations that seemed impossible to change. As I watched the light continue its work, I became aware of another truth. The prayers of those who fasted didn't just affect their own lives. They extended outward, covering others in protection and blessing. I saw flashes of families surrounded by a shield-like glow, a direct result of someone fasting on their behalf. It became clear to me that fasting wasn't just an individual act. It created ripples that spread far and wide. Parents fasting for their children, friends fasting for loved ones, entire communities coming together in prayer and fasting. It all had a tangible, lasting impact. The light they generated didn't fade. It lingered, creating a shield that stretched across generations. I was shown glimpses of how these prayers influenced the physical world. Relationships that seemed broken beyond repair were mended. Addictions that had held people captive for years were broken. Entire neighborhoods, once weighed down by despair, began to flourish as the darkness was driven away. But what struck me most was the realization that fasting didn't just protect, it empowered. I saw fasting believers clothed in what looked like spiritual armor, glowing with the same light as the threads of prayer. Their prayers didn't just rise passively. They surged upward with a strength that pushed back against forces I couldn't fully see but knew were there. This armor wasn't flashy or intimidating. It was pure and radiant, and it seemed to amplify their prayers. It made them bold, unwavering. I understood then that fasting wasn't just about drawing closer to God. It was about stepping into a spiritual battle fully equipped. As I stood there, absorbing all of this, I began to notice something else. The prayers of those fasting didn't just move upward, they moved outward as well. The light illuminated corners of the earth that had been shrouded in darkness for so long that they seemed forgotten. I saw prayers touching people who weren't even aware they were being prayed for. A mother fasting for her estranged son, her prayers reaching him in his moment of despair. A small group of believers fasting for their city, their light spreading across streets and buildings, bringing hope to those who had given up. And then there was a moment of profound clarity. Fasting wasn't limited by time. I saw how the prayers of fasting believers reached not only their present circumstances, but also their future generations. It was as if the light they created planted seeds that would grow long after they were gone. This realization overwhelmed me. The simplicity of fasting, a practice often overlooked or dismissed, held a power that extended far beyond the physical realm. It bridged the gap between earth and heaven, creating connections that defied human understanding. I felt a deep sense of responsibility in that moment. This wasn't just knowledge to keep for myself. It was something I was meant to carry back with me, to share with others. Fasting wasn't just a tool for personal growth. It was a divine gift, a way to partner with God in transforming the world. As these truths settled in my heart, the light around me seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, as though affirming what I had just witnessed. I stood there, humbled and in awe, knowing that this was only the beginning of what I was being shown. As I stood in the realm of light, absorbing all the revelations about the power of fasting, I began to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The peace and clarity that had filled the space started to waver, and a sense of tension crept in. It was as if something was lurking just beyond my sight, something dark and oppressive that was fighting against all the beauty I had just witnessed. I didn't understand what was happening at first, but then it became clear. I saw it, not with my physical eyes, but in my spirit. A shadow was creeping into the light, as though it were trying to drown out the glow of the prayers. The dark mist that had surrounded the earth earlier began to twist and contort, growing thicker and more menacing. It wasn't just a mist now, it was a force, a presence that seemed to work tirelessly, desperately trying to block the prayers of fasting believers from reaching their full potential. The threads of light that had once pierced through the darkness were now being resisted by something much stronger, something that sought to push them back. I could feel the weight of it, the way it clung to the edges of everything, pressing in on the light. The darkness wasn't passive, it was fighting, actively resisting the breakthroughs that fasting was bringing. The more I focused on it, the more I realized what I was witnessing. This was a spiritual battle. There were forces, dark, oppressive forces, that worked relentlessly to discourage fasting. I could sense their determination, their awareness of the incredible power fasting held. These forces understood that fasting could break chains, lift burdens, and change lives in ways nothing else could. They knew the truth. Fasting could shatter addictions, destroy generational curses, and tear down walls of spiritual oppression. I watched as the forces of darkness tried to keep people from engaging in this powerful practice. I saw whispers of doubt creeping into the hearts of those who felt called to fast. Thoughts of, "It's too hard," or "It won't work," or "It's not worth it." These whispers grew louder, more persistent, each one designed to weaken the resolve of those who might otherwise stand firm in their fasting. But what struck me most was the realization that these forces didn't just target individuals, they went after entire communities, entire groups of believers. I saw how, when believers united in fasting, the power of their prayers multiplied. It wasn't just about one person fasting, it was about the collective force of many, coming together in a shared purpose. I saw a scene unfold before me, one that felt as real as anything I'd ever experienced. A group of people, gathered together, standing side by side, each one engaged in a corporate fast. Their prayers didn't just rise as individual threads of light, they rose as a storm, a powerful, unified force that shook the very foundations of the spiritual realm. This wasn't just a small flicker of light, it was a storm, a wave of spiritual power that threatened to sweep away everything in its path. The forces of darkness, which had once seemed so strong, now shrank back in fear, unable to withstand the surge of divine energy that came from the united prayers of the believers. The storm of light and prayer swept across the land, and I saw how entire cities were affected by it. What had once been a place of spiritual oppression was now filled with light. People who had been bound by addiction and despair found freedom. Families that had been torn apart by generational curses were healed. Communities that had been divided were brought together. It was as if the very air itself was changing, shifting from darkness to light. I could see the ripple effects of their collective fasting, a transformation that reached deep into the physical world, affecting lives in ways no one could deny. It was a spiritual storm, and it was powerful enough to change the very course of entire cities. I couldn't help but marvel at the magnitude of it all. What had once seemed like an individual act, fasting, was now revealed to be a force of nature, capable of altering the fabric of reality itself. But the darkness wasn't gone. As the storm of light spread, I saw how the forces of evil regrouped, trying to find new ways to resist. It was a battle that was never fully won in a single moment. There was always more to fight for, always more ground to take. I saw how the battle was fought on multiple fronts, on the individual level, in families, in communities, and in nations. The forces of darkness were relentless, but the power of fasting was greater. Every prayer, every act of fasting was like a blow struck against the enemy, weakening their grip and pushing them back. In that moment, I understood the importance of what I'd witnessed. Fasting wasn't just a personal practice, it was a weapon capable of breaking spiritual strongholds and transforming entire communities. And the enemy knew it. I felt a sense of urgency in my heart. This wasn't just something to witness, it was something to take action on. I couldn't just go back to my life as if nothing had changed. I was being shown a truth that needed to be shared. Fasting wasn't just a tool for personal growth. It was a spiritual weapon that could change the world. The vision faded, and I felt myself being pulled back, as though the light was drawing me away from the battle. But I knew one thing for sure. When I returned, I would never look at fasting the same way again. As I was drawn back into the realm of light, I felt a sense of peace flood my spirit. The battle between light and darkness had left its mark on me. But now, a new presence seemed to fill the space, one that was pure and profound. It was as though everything else faded away, and all I could feel was a deep, all-encompassing love. I looked up, and there, standing before me, was Jesus. I recognized him instantly, not from any earthly image, but in a way that transcended my understanding. His presence was radiant, yet gentle, powerful, yet filled with such tender compassion that it nearly overwhelmed me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt as though he was looking directly into the very depths of my soul. Without speaking a word, he reached out. His hands extended in a way that felt inviting, yet deeply authoritative. There was something in his gaze, something that communicated without needing to be said. He was interceding. I could feel his intercession, passionate, focused, full of love for humanity. And yet I understood that his prayers were not for himself, but for us, for those of us who were striving to draw closer to God. His presence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. As I stood before him, I felt a deep connection, as though he knew me better than I knew myself. His love was so tangible. It was as if I could physically feel it wrapping around my heart, healing wounds I didn't even realize were there. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with it an authority that echoed deep within me. "Fasting," he said, his words settling in my spirit, "aligns you with my divine will." I could feel the truth of his words like a spark of understanding igniting within me. In that moment, it became clear. Fasting wasn't just about giving up food or taking a break from life's distractions. It was a way to draw closer to God, to align ourselves with his purposes. Through fasting, we were positioning ourselves to be more receptive to his voice, more open to his plans. As he spoke, I felt a shift in my own heart, a deep yearning to be aligned with him, to hear his voice more clearly. It was as if fasting allowed the clutter of my own thoughts and desires to fade away, leaving space for God's will to take center stage. Jesus continued, "Fasting creates a clearer spiritual frequency." His words resonated with me, and it was as though the concept of spiritual clarity was becoming tangible. I saw it in my mind. A radio dial, once fuzzy and unclear, slowly coming into focus. Through fasting, the static of life, the noise of distractions, and the pull of worldly desires were silenced, allowing God's voice to be heard more clearly. In that moment, I understood. Fasting wasn't just a physical act, it was a spiritual tuning. It was a way to clear the channels, to make it easier to hear from God, to know His plans, His desires. When we fasted, we weren't just denying ourselves, we were creating space for divine clarity, for the frequency of God's will to resonate more strongly within us. But then, a sobering truth surfaced. Jesus looked at me, and the compassion in His eyes deepened as He spoke again, His tone more serious. Fasting without humility and sincerity is of no use. The words hit me hard. I had heard of fasting for personal gain or out of a sense of duty, but in this moment, I realized just how empty that kind of fasting was. The act of fasting wasn't meant to be a mere ritual. It was meant to come from a place of deep humility. It was about surrender, surrendering our own desires, our own will, and aligning them with God's. Jesus' warning echoed in my mind. Without humility, without sincerity, fasting became just a physical practice, a set of actions without the depth that made it truly powerful. It was the heart behind the fast that mattered most. The act itself was only a tool, but the sincerity with which it was done was what made it effective in the spiritual realm. I realized, too, that fasting wasn't just about hearing God's voice more clearly. It was about aligning our hearts with His. It was a way to humble ourselves, to acknowledge that we were not in control, that we were dependent on God's wisdom and guidance. It was about surrendering our own will and trusting that His plans for us were far greater than our own. In that moment, I felt the weight of what He was saying. Fasting wasn't something to be done casually or with a sense of entitlement. It was an invitation to come before God in humility, with an open heart and a willingness to listen. It was about creating space for His will to be done in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Jesus' words left an indelible mark on my heart. I knew that this wasn't just a teaching, it was a challenge to approach fasting with the right heart, with humility and sincerity. It was an invitation to draw closer to God, to become more attuned to His voice, and to allow His will to shape every aspect of my life. As I stood there, feeling His love and hearing His message, I knew that this encounter would stay with me forever. It wasn't just about fasting. It was about aligning myself with the heart of God, about allowing His will to flow through me in a way that would transform not just my life, but the lives of those around me. As the moment with Jesus lingered in my heart, I felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility settle over me. The clarity, the deep connection to His voice, and the understanding that fasting was more than just an individual practice. It was a powerful tool for the times ahead. Jesus' words had cut through me like a sword, but they weren't harsh. Instead, they carried a sense of urgency and grace. I knew, deep within, that I was being entrusted with something incredibly important. After a long pause, He spoke again, His voice soft but filled with conviction. "Olivia," He began, "I have shown you the power of fasting, the way it aligns you with my will, the way it brings clarity and strengthens you for battle. But now, you must share this with the world." I felt my heart race as He continued. "The days ahead will be difficult, and many will face trials both spiritual and earthly. Fasting will be one of the keys to surviving these times, one of the ways to prepare for what is to come." His words struck me deeply. It was as if I was hearing a warning, a divine alert. There was no doubt in my mind that the world I had left behind was not the same world I would return to. Things were changing, and the challenges ahead were more significant than I had ever imagined. But what Jesus was showing me was that fasting would be essential to navigating those challenges. It wasn't just about drawing closer to God or finding personal clarity anymore. It was about preparing for the future, preparing for the battles that would be fought in the unseen realms. I couldn't shake the weight of what he was saying. Fasting would become a shield for believers, a way to protect ourselves and our loved ones as the world faced spiritual and earthly upheavals. But it wasn't just for personal protection. It was a way to stand in the gap for others, to pray for those who didn't yet understand the power of fasting. I was being given a vision of a world where believers would need to stand firm in their faith, and fasting would be one of the most powerful weapons in their arsenal. It was a way to prepare spiritually, to build up strength for what lay ahead. Jesus' words seemed to echo in my heart, and I understood that my mission was not over. It was just beginning. He looked at me with deep compassion, his gaze steady and unshaken. Fasting will be a refuge for my people, a way to find strength in the storms that are coming. Those who embrace it will be equipped to endure, to face the trials ahead with courage and faith. I felt as though the very weight of what he was saying was settling deep in my spirit. I wasn't just learning about fasting for my own benefit. I was being prepared to help others understand it too. It wasn't enough for me to keep this experience to myself. The world needed to know what I had learned. It wasn't just about a physical act of denial. It was about a spiritual transformation that could carry believers through the hardest times. There was a sense of urgency now in his words. I realized that fasting wasn't just something we could choose to do in passing. It was something that would be necessary, a tool that believers would need to wield in the coming days. It would be a lifeline. Jesus continued, his voice clear and filled with love. Tell them to fast with purpose. Tell them to fast with humility. Tell them to fast for the strength they will need to face the trials ahead. This is not a time for shallow fasting. It is a time to seek my will, to align your heart with my purposes. I nodded, knowing this wasn't a message I could ignore or delay. The time for action was now. As the vision around me started to shift and change, I felt the weight of what I was being called to do. I knew I had to share what I had experienced with others. There were people out there who didn't understand the power of fasting, and they needed to know. Jesus, seeing my understanding, smiled softly. It was a smile of encouragement, one that filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. You will teach them. You will share your story. You will help others see the power that lies in fasting, the power that will help them stand firm when the world begins to shake. As I stood there in his presence, I realized that my life would never be the same again. The experiences I had just lived through, my car accident, my spiritual journey, the encounter with Jesus, were not random. They were part of a greater purpose. I was being sent out to share what I had learned, to awaken others to the power of fasting and prayer. The vision began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back toward my earthly body. But even as I returned to the world I had known, I carried with me the knowledge that I had been called to something bigger than myself. I opened my eyes, but the impact of what I had just experienced remained in my heart. I had a mission now, one that would require every ounce of courage, humility, and faith. I was no longer just Olivia Carter, the teacher. I was someone who had seen beyond the veil, who had been shown the truth about fasting, and who was now called to share that truth with the world. The message was clear. Fasting wasn't just a choice, it was a calling, and the world would need it more than ever in the days to come. I woke up with a start. The sterile smell of the hospital room hit me, but I couldn't quite make sense of where I was or how I got there. My head was heavy, my body limp, and yet there was an undeniable feeling of peace washing over me. I slowly blinked my eyes open, trying to clear the fog from my mind. The soft beeping of a heart monitor and the distant murmur of voices were the first things I heard. Then a voice spoke directly to me, filled with concern. "Olivia, can you hear me?" I tried to move, but my body felt strangely disconnected. It took a moment for me to realize that I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. I looked around, but the scene was blurry. Everything seemed distant, as though I was seeing it from underwater. I turned my head slightly and saw a doctor standing by the side of the bed, her expression full of disbelief. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered more to herself than to anyone else. She should be. Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the urgency in the quiet chaos of the room. "How is this even possible?" another voice whispered. I wanted to speak, to ask them what had happened, but my mouth felt dry. My thoughts were clouded, still drifting between the dreamlike world I had just come from and this reality that didn't seem to make sense. A nurse walked over, adjusting the monitors. "Doctor, she's stable, but this is beyond anything I've ever seen. Her vital signs are strong. She should have been dead." The words stung, and for a brief moment I felt disoriented. Dead? But I was here, alive. I was in one piece. I was breathing. And then it hit me. The accident, the darkness, and the vast, shining realm I had visited, the encounter with Jesus, the message he had given me. It all rushed back to me in an instant. I couldn't believe it. It was like waking from a dream so real that I couldn't tell where the dream ended and the reality began. But this wasn't a dream. It wasn't a vision. It had all been real. The doctor leaned in, looking at me closely. "Olivia, do you remember what happened? You were in a serious accident and you were gone for 8 minutes. You were clinically dead." I nodded, my mind reeling. I wanted to say so much, but the words were tangled. How could I explain what I had just experienced? How could I tell them about the spiritual world I had visited, the things I had learned there, the power of fasting? The doctor seemed confused, perhaps even worried. She glanced at the nurse, who was still shaking her head in disbelief. "We've never seen anything like this," the nurse said softly, almost reverently. "This is miraculous." That word hit me like a lightning bolt. Miraculous. I had been saved. Not by chance, not by medicine, but by something far greater. My survival was nothing short of divine intervention. There was no other explanation. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of it all to settle over me. Everything I had experienced, the fast, the car accident, the spiritual realm, the encounter with Jesus, had led to this moment. I had been sent back. My life had been spared for a reason. I opened my eyes, meeting the doctor's gaze. "I'm okay," I said quietly, though I knew I wasn't just talking about my physical state. I was more than okay. I was changed. The doctor gave me a small smile, still uncertain. "You don't look like someone who just came back from the dead." I returned her smile, but in my heart, I knew the truth. I wasn't just back from the dead. I had been given a second chance, a chance to fulfill the purpose I had been shown in that other realm. As the days passed, I began to process everything that had happened to me, and I realized that I couldn't go back to my old life. I couldn't just return to being the teacher I had been, going through the motions of life as if nothing had changed. What I had learned, what I had seen, demanded more from me. I knew I had been given a powerful message, and it was my responsibility to share it. Fasting, prayer, spiritual clarity. These weren't just concepts. They were keys to surviving the trials ahead, keys to spiritual breakthroughs, keys to a deeper connection with God. I knew now that my mission was to teach others what I had learned. I had to share the truth about fasting, not just as a spiritual practice, but as a weapon in the battles to come. I began speaking to small groups, sharing my experience and teaching them the power of fasting and prayer. The more I shared, the more I realized that there were many people just like me, people who were seeking, people who were struggling, people who needed a breakthrough. And with every story I shared, I saw their eyes light up with understanding. They began to grasp the power of fasting, not just as a way to give up food, but as a way to align themselves with God, to fight the spiritual battles we all face. Word began to spread, and I found myself speaking to larger groups, to people who were eager to learn, to tap into the untapped spiritual power I had been shown. It became my mission to help others prepare for the challenges ahead, to teach them how to fast with purpose, how to align their hearts with God's will, and how to access the spiritual strength they needed to endure. Each time I spoke, I felt the weight of what Jesus had shared with me, and I knew I was doing the right thing. My life had been spared for a reason, and I had a purpose. I was no longer just Olivia Carter, the teacher. I was Olivia Carter, the advocate for spiritual breakthroughs, the one who had been shown the power of fasting and prayer, and who now shared that knowledge with the world. In the end, I knew that my story wasn't just about survival. It was about purpose. It was about fulfilling the calling I had received, a calling that would take me beyond anything I could have ever imagined. And as I shared this truth with others, I saw the spiritual breakthroughs unfolding before my eyes, one life at a time. I was living my purpose now, no longer lost, but walking with clear direction. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning.